At the will reading, my parents laughed out loud while handing my sister $7.2 million. Me. They gave me exactly $2 and a battered old briefcase telling me to go earn my own, because some kids just do not measure up. My white brother-in-law even mocked my PR business. I just smiled and pocketed the cash. But when the lawyer opened my grandfather's final sealed letter and read what those $2 actually bought, my mother started screaming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Jasmine, 35 years old. I am used to walking into rooms thick with tension, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer suffocating coldness of the mahogany-lined boardroom at Sterling and Associates on a dreary Tuesday morning. We were there for the reading of my grandfather Elijah's will. My mother Denise sat directly across from me, tapping her manicured acrylic nails against the polished wood table. She wore a black designer dress, radiating eager anticipation to claim her share of the empire. Beside her sat my sister Aaliyah, the undisputed golden child. Aaliyah sat close to her white husband Connor, an arrogant venture capitalist. He always looked at me like a bad investment. My father Terrence sat at the head of the table, aggressively checking his gold watch. "Let us just get this over with." My mother sighed, waving her hand impatiently at Mr. Sterling, the family lawyer. We all know Elijah wanted the legacy protected by those who actually know how to manage wealth. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, adjusted his reading glasses, and opened the thick leather-bound folder. The breakdown of the estate was swift and brutal. The $7.2 million in liquid cash assets, the sprawling family estate in the Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta, and the vacation property in Martha's Vineyard were to be split evenly between my parents and Aaliyah. The room instantly erupted in soft, triumphant cheers. Aaliyah let out a little squeal of delight and clapped her hands. Connor leaned over and kissed her cheek, a greedy smile stretching across his face. My father exhaled pure satisfaction. My mother actually beamed, looking around the room as if she had just won a hard-fought battle. And then there was just me. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And to my eldest granddaughter, Jasmine, Mr. Sterling continued, his voice cutting through their premature celebration. The room fell completely dead silent. Every eye turned toward me. My mother gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. Connor narrowed his eyes, staring at me with open hostility. "I leave the sum of exactly $2, Mr. Sterling read out loud, along with the contents of the black leather briefcase currently resting under this table. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved, and then the cruel laughter started. It began as a low chuckle from Connor before erupting into full-blown cackling from my mother. Denise actually threw her head back and laughed out loud, the sound bouncing off the mahogany walls. $2? My mother gasped. $2? Well, Jasmine, you always insisted on being so fiercely independent. Go earn your own. She leaned forward, locking onto my gaze. Some kids just do not measure up to the family name, and it seems your grandfather finally saw what we have known all along. Aaliyah smirked, playing with her diamond tennis bracelet. It is fitting, really. You always wanted to do things the hard way without any help. Well, now you get your wish. Connor leaned across the table, his blue eyes gleaming with raw condescension. Do not spend it all in one place, Jasmine. Though with your struggling little PR gig, you probably need those $2 to cover your office rent this month. I did not flinch. I just looked at the three of them, absorbing the sheer toxicity they exuded. This was the exact dynamic I had navigated my entire life. When Aaliyah turned 16, my parents bought her a brand new luxury sedan with a giant red bow on top. When I turned 16, my father handed me a bus schedule and told me to figure out how to get to my after-school job. When Aaliyah dropped out of 2 master degree programs, my parents praised her and handed her hundreds of thousands to start a failing wellness brand. When I built my PR firm from the ground up, landing corporate clients without their money, my father said I was just playing business. Grandpa Elijah had been the only person who saw the truth. He knew my family cared only about projecting an image of Black excellence, not the work required to build it. He knew my business was thriving because I had earned every contract through strategy and grit. Mr. Sterling slid two crisp $1 bills across the polished wood table toward me. I reached out calmly, picked them up, and folded them neatly into my purse. Then I reached under my chair and pulled out the worn black leather briefcase, placing it gently on the table. The leather was scuffed at the corners, smelling faintly of the pipe tobacco my grandfather used to smoke. "Is there a codicil?" "Mr. Sterling," I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level, refusing to give them the emotional reaction they so desperately craved. My father scoffed, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "A codicil for what, Jasmine?" "How to invest $2. Stop dragging this out. Take your briefcase of photos and let us handle business. We have transfers to authorize right now." "Actually, Terrence," Mr. Sterling interrupted, raising a hand to silence my father. "There is a final letter. It was placed in my care with strict instructions to be read only after the initial asset distribution was announced. It is addressed to the family." The smugness instantly evaporated from my mother's face. Connor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his arrogant posture suddenly rigid. My father leaned forward, his brow furrowed in suspicion. Mr. Sterling pulled a sealed ivory envelope from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He broke the wax seal, carefully unfolded the thick parchment paper, and began to read. "To my family. If you are hearing this, it means the cash and the residential properties have been distributed. Terrence Denise Aaliyah, you have received the liquid assets you always coveted. You have your millions. But true wealth is not cash. True wealth is infrastructure. True wealth is control." Mr. Sterling paused and looked up over his glasses directly at me before returning to the letter. "The $7.2 million in cash you have inherited is deeply tied to the operational profits of Elijah Logistics, LLC. It is the fruit of my labor. But the tree bearing that fruit requires a strong hand to protect it." My mother's breathing became shallow. Connor's face lost all its color, draining to a sickly pale white. "And the $2 given to Jasmine," Mr. Sterling read. "That is not a punishment. It is the legally required consideration for a complete transfer of ownership. By accepting those $2, Jasmine has finalized the binding purchase agreement we drafted 6 months ago." A heavy, suffocating dread blanketed the room. I rested my hands on the black briefcase, feeling the solid weight of my grandfather's trust. "To clarify," Mr. Sterling said, setting the letter down, and looking directly at my mother, whose jaw hung open in absolute shock. "The Master Holding Corporation owns the real estate, the fleet patents, and the voting shares of the logistics empire. Jasmine is now the sole legal owner of the holding company. You inherited the cash, but she owns the vault it sits in. She controls the patents your ventures rely on. And as of this exact moment right now, she is officially your landlord." For a fraction of a second, the room was completely paralyzed. Then my mother let out a blood-curdling shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged across the mahogany table, her perfectly manicured hands clawing toward the black briefcase. My father grabbed her arm, pulling her back as she screamed obscenities. Aaliyah burst into panicked tears, clutching Connor's arm. But it was Connor's reaction that told the real story. His smile had vanished. He looked ill, staring at me with terrified eyes. We both knew the terrifying truth. His prestigious venture capital firm had been banking heavily on leveraging my grandfather's fleet patents to secure a massive corporate merger next week. A merger he had just lost complete control of because the awkward scapegoat sister he constantly mocked now held all the keys to the kingdom. The silence in the boardroom lasted only a fraction of a second before the reality of Mr. Sterling's words fully registered. The carefully constructed facade of my family shattered completely, giving way to absolute panic. My father Terrence slammed his open palms onto the polished mahogany table with such bone-jarring force that the crystal water glasses rattled and spilled over the legal documents. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, the kind of anger reserved exclusively for moments when he lost absolute control. He pointed a trembling finger at the lawyer, demanding that the proceedings be halted immediately. He shouted that my grandfather Elijah had been out of his mind, claiming the dementia must have taken hold during his final months. It was a pathetic and desperate lie. Grandpa Elijah had been sharper at 82 than my father had been his entire life. He played competitive chess every Sunday and reviewed complex corporate balance sheets for fun. But my father could not accept that the daughter he had spent 35 years belittling, the daughter he always pushed to the back of the family photographs, was now the sole architect of his financial future. My mother Denise joined the chorus of chaos, her perfectly modulated society voice turning harsh and shrill as she accused me of manipulating a dying old man. Aaliyah sat frozen in her seat, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as her hands shook uncontrollably. She looked to her husband for rescue, just as she had always looked to others to solve her problems her entire life. She whined that this was unfair, that she was supposed to be the face of the new legacy. Connor did not disappoint her. The suave, polished venture capitalist vanished in an instant, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. He pushed his chair back roughly and marched across the room. He was a large man, a former college athlete who used his physical size to dominate boardrooms and intimidate startup founders. He positioned his broad frame directly in front of the heavy double doors, effectively barricading my only exit from the firm. His blue eyes, which had gleamed with raw condescension just minutes ago, were now dark with manic urgency. He crossed his arms over his expensive tailored suit, staring down at me with a look of pure venom. He demanded that I put the black leather briefcase back on the table immediately. He told me I had no idea what I was dealing with, asserting that corporate holdings and commercial logistics patents were not a game for a boutique public relations consultant. "Listen to me, Jasmine," he barked, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "You do not know the first thing about managing generational wealth. You are a glorified party planner. Leave the heavy lifting to the men who actually run this industry." He then turned to Mr. Sterling and demanded that the lawyer draft a liability waiver right there on the spot. He ordered me to sign over my newly inherited voting shares to him and Aaliyah, promising to cut me a personal check for $50,000 as a courtesy. He called it a generous buyout for a clerical misunderstanding. The audacity was truly breathtaking. He was offering me $50,000 for a holding company worth hundreds of millions, and he delivered the insult with the absolute certainty of a privileged man who had never been told no. My mother cheered him on from the table, wiping her fake tears and telling me to take the money and stop embarrassing the family in front of the legal counsel. My father commanded me to listen to Connor, claiming that this was the only way to protect the family name from my inevitable incompetence. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink back into my chair. I did not give them the emotional breakdown they were trying to provoke. I simply picked up the worn black briefcase, feeling the sturdy handle against my palm, and stood up. My crimson suit felt like armor as I walked right up to Connor, stopping just inches from his chest. I looked up into his flushed face, refusing to break eye contact, and let a cold, calculating smile touch my lips. I told him that I did not need his $50,000. I told him that as the new sole owner of the Master Holding Corporation, I now possessed complete and absolute auditing rights over every single subsidiary under the Elijah Holdings umbrella. I watched his eyes widen as I specifically named his venture capital firm, Apex Capital. I reminded him that Apex had been exclusively managing the logistics accounts, the commercial freight lines, and the supply chain patents for the past 3 years. I kept my voice dangerously quiet, forcing him to lean in to hear the full weight of my threat. I told him that my very first act as the new owner would be to initiate an aggressive forensic audit of the operational profits his firm had supposedly been reinvesting. I watched the blood completely drain from Connor's face. The arrogant flush of privilege vanished entirely, leaving him a sickly, ghostly pale. A heavy bead of sweat formed at his temple and trickled down his jawline. His confident posture collapsed inward. He knew that I knew. He knew that an audit would expose whatever dirty accounting he had been hiding behind his polished quarterly presentations. He also knew that his firm was heavily relying on leveraging those exact logistics patents for a massive corporate merger next week, a merger he had just lost complete control of. His chest hitched as he struggled to draw a breath, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape route from the trap my grandfather had set. I did not blink. I told him to step aside right now before I made the impending audit public to his investors. Connor swallowed hard, his arms dropping limply to his sides. He stepped away from the heavy wooden door, his broad shoulders slumping in total defeat. The big, intimidating venture capitalist folded instantly under the weight of his own secrets. I reached out and gripped the brass handle of the boardroom door. Behind me, my father was shouting Connor's name, demanding to know why he was stepping aside and letting me walk away with the assets. My mother was shrieking at Mr. Sterling, threatening to have him disbarred and stripped of his license. Aaliyah was sobbing loudly, begging someone to please explain what was happening to her lifestyle brand funding. I did not turn around to look at them. I pulled the heavy door open and walked out into the quiet carpeted hallway of the law firm, leaving their chaotic screaming contained within those walls. I kept my posture perfectly straight as I walked past the reception desk, giving the wide-eyed secretary a polite nod. I pushed through the glass front doors and stepped out into the sweltering Atlanta heat. The midday sun beat down on the pavement, but I felt completely chilled with pure adrenaline. I walked toward my car, gripping the handle of my grandfather's briefcase tightly against my side. I had won the initial battle, but I knew my family well enough to know the war was just beginning. They would never surrender an empire without trying to destroy me first. They cared too much about their country club status, their luxury cars, and their meticulously curated public image to let me hold them accountable for their actions. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, tossing the heavy briefcase onto the passenger side. I let out a long, shaky breath, realizing for the first time how fast my heart was racing against my ribs. I reached for the ignition, but before I could even start the engine, my phone vibrated intensely in the center console. The screen lit up with an urgent, high-priority notification. It was not an angry text from my mother or a legal threat from my father. It was an automated alert from my primary bank. I picked up the phone, swiping to open the secure message. The bold red text stated that my personal checking, business accounts, and lines of credit had all been immediately frozen due to a sudden report of suspected fraudulent activity. I stared at the glowing screen, the reality of their ruthlessness washing over me in a cold wave. They had not even waited for me to leave the parking lot. They were using my father's extensive banking connections and board memberships to cut off my cash flow instantly. They wanted to starve me out, to cripple my PR firm, and force me into submission before I could even open the briefcase and see what weapons I had at my disposal. The two $1 bills resting in my pocket were suddenly the only liquid assets I had left to my name. I sat in the sweltering heat of my car, staring at the glowing red text on my banking app. Zero available balance. They had moved with terrifying speed, leveraging my father's influence on the bank board to instantly choke my finances. I placed my phone on the passenger seat, right next to the worn black briefcase, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Panic was exactly what they wanted. They expected me to come crawling back to the law firm, begging for access to my own money, ready to sign away the holding company for whatever breadcrumbs Connor offered. Instead, I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking garage. I needed to get back to my office to strategize, but I had barely merged onto Peachtree Street when my phone began to vibrate violently against the leather console. It was not just one notification, it was a relentless, continuous flood of alerts. Text messages from casual acquaintances, direct messages from strangers, and a sudden spike in social media mentions. I pulled into a shaded spot behind a coffee shop and picked up my phone. My stomach plummeted. The notifications were all linking back to a single source. Aaliyah was currently broadcasting live on Instagram to her 500,000 followers. I tapped the notification, and my sister's face filled the screen. She was sitting in the back of Connor's luxury SUV, looking utterly devastated. Her flawless makeup was deliberately smudged beneath her eyes to simulate hours of crying. She wore a black silk scarf draped over her shoulders, the very picture of a grieving granddaughter. The viewer count in the top corner was skyrocketing, jumping by thousands every few seconds as the dramatic broadcast gained traction. I turned up the volume, listening to the wavering, trembling voice she had perfected since childhood, whenever she wanted to avoid a consequence. I did not want to bring family business onto a public platform. Aaliyah sniffled, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. But I owe it to my grandfather's memory to tell the truth. Our family is going through an unimaginable nightmare right now. My older sister Jasmine has done something completely unforgivable. I gripped the steering wheel, watching the comments flood the screen. People were sending heart emojis, praying hands, and messages of absolute support. Aaliyah let out a ragged sob, looking directly into the camera lens. My grandfather Elijah passed away recently, and he was suffering from severe cognitive decline during his final months. We were all just trying to keep him comfortable. But Jasmine isolated him. She manipulated a dying, confused old man into signing away the foundation of our entire family legacy. She coerced him into giving her total control over the business he built from scratch. My jaw locked tight. She was delivering a masterclass in manipulation. She expertly painted me as a predatory elder abuser while conveniently omitting the minor detail that she and my parents had just walked away with over $7 million in untethered cash. To her massive audience, she was the victimized granddaughter stripped of her rightful heritage by a bitter, greedy sibling. It hurts so much because I always tried to include her. Aaliyah continued, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. But Jasmine always resented my success. She hated it when my wellness brand took off. She could never stand the fact that I found happiness with Connor or that my parents were proud of me. She has been harboring this dark, toxic jealousy her entire life, and now she has weaponized it against a grieving family. She stole my grandfather's life work just to punish me for having the life she always wanted. The sheer audacity of her narrative was breathtaking. Her wellness brand had never taken off. It was a spectacular failure that bled cash, requiring constant, massive bailouts from my parents just to keep the lights on and the aesthetic flawless. Her so-called success was a subsidized illusion. Meanwhile, I had spent a decade building my crisis management firm entirely on my own, refusing their money and their influence. Because I chose the quiet grind over the glamorous spotlight, I was an easy target to paint as the jealous older sister lurking in the shadows. The comments rolling in beneath her video were vicious. Strangers were calling me a monster, a thief, and a disgrace to the Black community. They were tagging my public relations firm, demanding that my clients drop me. Aaliyah was not just venting her frustrations. She was executing a highly coordinated character assassination designed to destroy my professional reputation before I could even process my inheritance. She knew that in the world of public relations, image is the only currency that matters. If my name was synonymous with elder abuse and corporate theft, my career would be over by sunset. Please keep our family in your prayers, Aaliyah concluded, leaning her head against the leather car seat, looking exhausted and fragile. We are exploring all our legal options to save my grandfather's legacy from this horrific theft. Thank you for loving us and supporting us through this dark time. She ended the broadcast. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, letting out a sharp breath. The freeze on my bank accounts had been my father's doing a swift tactical strike to paralyze me financially. But this public smear campaign was entirely the work of my mother, Denise. Aaliyah was simply the beautiful, tearful mouthpiece delivering the script my mother had hastily written in the car ride from the law firm. They were running a textbook crisis diversion playbook. By controlling the narrative early and loudly, they were framing me as the aggressor, making any subsequent move I made look like the desperate actions of a guilty woman. I put the car back in drive, forcing my hands to relax their death grip on the steering wheel. I could not afford to act on emotion. I needed to get to a secure location, open the black briefcase, and formulate a counter-strategy using the actual documents my grandfather had left me. The $2 in my pocket felt incredibly heavy, a tangible reminder of the target now painted squarely on my back. I navigated the heavy Atlanta traffic, my mind racing through possible damage control protocols. I needed to draft a holding statement immediately. I needed to contact my primary clients and reassure them before Aaliyah's live stream breached the mainstream business news cycle. I pulled into the parking lot of my office building, a modest but professional space in Midtown. Just as I shifted into park, my phone rang again, cutting through the silence of the car. The caller identification displayed the name Marcus Vance. Marcus was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Innovations, a highly prominent Black-owned tech company based in Atlanta. He was my flagship client. Securing his account 2 years ago had put my boutique firm on the map, allowing me to expand my operations and hire dedicated staff. He was a man who valued discretion, integrity, and absolute professionalism above all else. I cleared my throat, smoothing my voice into its most reassuring professional tone before answering. Marcus, it is great to hear from you. I was actually just about to call your office regarding the upcoming quarterly strategy. Jasmine, I am going to stop you right there, Marcus said. His voice lacked its usual warm southern cadence. It was flat cold and strictly business. We are terminating our retainer effective immediately. The legal team is sending over the cancellation paperwork as we speak. The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. I sat frozen, the engine of my car still idling. Marcus, I understand that you might have seen some noise online today, but I assure you that is an internal family dispute being blown vastly out of proportion for social media engagement. As a crisis management professional, I already have a containment strategy in place. This will not affect my firm or your brand in any capacity. This is not about an Instagram video, Jasmine, Marcus replied, his tone dropping an octave. This is about the phone call I received 20 minutes ago from your mother. My blood ran cold. Denise had not just coached Aaliyah on the social media front. She was actively dialing her society contacts, burning my professional bridges one by one. Your mother serves on the regional charity board with my wife? Marcus continued, the disappointment evident in his voice. She called me directly in tears. She told me about the situation with your grandfather's estate. She told me that you are currently undergoing a severe mental health crisis and that you have illegally seized corporate assets. She warned me out of concern for my business that you are unstable and acting maliciously against your own flesh and blood. Marcus, that is a complete fabrication, I said, fighting to keep the desperation out of my voice. They are trying to force me out of a legal inheritance. You know my work ethic. You know my character. I know that where there is smoke, there is usually a fire, Marcus interrupted. Vanguard Innovations cannot be associated with this kind of messy public spectacle. If you are willing to manipulate a dying family member, I cannot trust you with my corporate reputation. Do not contact my office again, Jasmine. We will settle the final invoice through the lawyers. The line went dead. The silence in the car was deafening. I slowly lowered the phone, staring blankly at the dashboard. My mother had not just spread rumors. She had weaponized her decades of country club networking to systematically assassinate my livelihood. She knew exactly which pressure points to hit to make me toxic to my own clients. With my bank accounts frozen by my father and my primary income stream severed by my mother, I was completely cut off. I looked over at the battered black briefcase sitting innocently on the passenger seat. My family had just declared total war over whatever was inside it. I grabbed the handle, stepped out of the car, and walked toward my office, ready to find out exactly what my grandfather had given me. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of my office building, the adrenaline from the parking lot still humming in my veins. My public relations firm occupied a modest but elegant corner suite on the 3rd floor. I had designed the space myself, paying for every sleek desk and piece of modern artwork with profits I had generated without a single dime of my parents' money. As I stepped off the elevator, the first thing I noticed was not the usual soothing hum of productivity, but a stark white sheet of paper taped directly over my frosted glass logo. I approached it slowly, my heels clicking against the polished concrete floor. It was an official legal document, an eviction notice. The property management company cited a sudden and newly discovered lease violation regarding commercial zoning regulations. The signature at the bottom belonged to Richard Sterling, a prominent real estate developer who just so happened to be my father's oldest college fraternity brother and regular golf partner. My father had frozen my accounts to paralyze me. He had called in his favors to literally strip the roof from over my business. He was using the very connections I had worked so hard to navigate independently to crush me into submission. They wanted me desperate enough to crawl back to that mahogany boardroom and hand over the holding company for whatever petty cash Connor felt like tossing my way. I ripped the notice from the glass, crumpling the thick paper in my fist, and pushed open the door to my office suite. The scene inside was pure, unadulterated chaos. The reception desk phone system was lighting up like a holiday display, ringing incessantly. My executive assistant, Maya, was frantically typing on her keyboard, a headset pressed to her ear, looking like she was on the verge of a panic attack. When she saw me walk in, she dropped the headset onto her desk and let out a breathless gasp. "Jasmine, thank goodness you are here." Maya rushed toward me, her eyes wide with sheer panic. "The phones have not stopped ringing for the last hour. 3 of our biggest corporate vendors just called to cancel our event contracts for the upcoming quarter. They said they were advised by their board members that our firm is undergoing a hostile restructuring. And that is not even the worst part. The regional director for the Horizon Tech account just emailed to terminate their retainer." They attached a forwarded message from a society mailing list. Maya handed me a printed copy of the email. I stared at the paper, my blood turning to ice. The email was a masterfully crafted piece of character assassination written directly from my mother's personal account. It was addressed to her vast network of high society friends, charity board members, and corporate wives. Denise had written a heartbreaking message, apologizing for my recent erratic behavior. She claimed I was suffering from a severe psychological breakdown, that I had become dangerously unstable, and that I was currently under investigation for stealing family assets to fund a lavish secret lifestyle. She urged everyone to pause any professional dealings with me out of concern for my mental health and their corporate liability. My mother was not just burning my bridges. She was salting the earth. She was weaponizing the language of mental health to paint me as a volatile liability, perfectly validating the tearful narrative Aaliyah had just broadcasted to 500,000 people on social media. They were executing a synchronized, flawless smear campaign to starve the scapegoat. If I had no clients, I had no income. If I had no office, I had no credibility. Without credibility, I had no power to stand against Connor. Maya looked at me, her hands trembling. "Jasmine, what do we do? Do we issue a press release? Do we call the clients back and explain the situation?" I looked at the crumpled eviction notice in my hand, and then at the black leather briefcase resting heavily against my side. If I engaged in a public mudslinging contest with my own mother and sister, I would only prove their narrative. A crisis public relations consultant who loses control of her own crisis is an absolute liability. I needed to move with absolute calculated precision, and I could not do that while putting my staff in the crossfire of my family drama. "We do not say a word to the press," I told Maya, keeping my voice remarkably steady. "I want you to forward the phones to the answering service. Pack up your personal belongings and go home. I am putting you and the rest of the staff on paid administrative leave for the next 2 weeks." Maya protested, insisting she wanted to help me fight this injustice, but I held up a hand to stop her. "My family plays extremely dirty, Maya. I will not have you or your career dragged through the mud because of my mother's toxicity. Go home right now. I will handle this situation personally." It took 30 minutes to secure the office completely. I unplugged the local servers, locked the physical filing cabinets, and forwarded the essential client emails to an encrypted private server. I walked out of the beautiful suite I had built with my own 2 hands, leaving the dark, empty space behind me. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of hyper-focused adrenaline. My phone continued to vibrate violently against the passenger seat, demanding my attention with every new notification, every canceled contract, every hateful comment from Aaliyah's blind loyal followers. My family expected me to break under this immense pressure. They expected me to throw a social media tantrum, to call my father crying, to beg my mother to stop the bleeding. They expected the lifelong scapegoat to finally submit to the golden child. I pulled into the underground parking garage of my apartment building, bypassing the main lobby entirely to avoid anyone who might have seen Aaliyah's live broadcast. When I finally walked through my front door, I locked the deadbolt and engaged the heavy security chain. I dropped my car keys on the granite counter and grabbed my phone. It was practically burning with the sheer volume of incoming hostility. I did not read a single hostile message. I pressed the power button, holding it down until the screen went completely black. I tossed the dead device onto the kitchen island, severing my connection to their toxic noise. The silence in my apartment was sudden and absolute. I carried the battered black leather briefcase to my dining table. The leather was worn soft with age, carrying the faint, familiar scent of Grandpa Elijah's study. For a moment, I just let my hands rest on the cold brass latches. My family thought this was a cruel joke. They honestly thought my grandfather had given me a worthless piece of vintage luggage to mock me from beyond the grave. But Grandpa Elijah never did anything without a profound strategic purpose. He was a master chess player who always saw 10 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. I popped the twin brass latches. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the quiet dining room. I slowly lifted the heavy leather lid, pushing it all the way back. The inside was not filled with sentimental photographs or meaningless family heirlooms, as my father had so arrogantly assumed in the boardroom. The interior was lined with dense protective foam. Embedded perfectly into the precision-cut foam inserts were 4 high-capacity encrypted flash drives. Beside them lay a thick leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat rows of handwritten numbers and dates. Resting directly on top of the financial ledger was a single sheet of heavy ivory parchment paper. I recognized my grandfather's elegant, sweeping, cursive handwriting immediately. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the paper, holding it up to the afternoon light streaming through my apartment window. The message was short, but the words hit me with the force of a runaway freight train. Jasmine, the note began. If you are reading this, you have accepted the $2 and taken ownership of the holding company. You are now standing in the center of the storm. I know your mother and father are likely trying to break you. I know Aaliyah is performing for her audience. Do not let their noise distract you from the truth. They only care about the image, Jasmine. They care about the country club memberships, the luxury cars, and the illusion of absolute perfection. But lasting empires are not built on fragile illusions. They are built on ledgers. Do not fight them in the press. Follow the money. Watch Connor. He has been hiding his actions in plain sight, and your family is too blinded by his elite pedigree to see the rot spreading underneath. The drives contain the unedited corporate accounts for the past 5 years. Use your brilliant mind. End the game once and for all and take back our family legacy. I set the ivory parchment aside and reached for the first encrypted flash drive. My hands were steady. The panic my parents had tried to instill in me had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. I walked to my office and booted up my secure laptop. The machine was air-gapped, disconnected from any wireless networks my family might try to compromise. I inserted the drive into the port. A sterile password prompt instantly flashed across the black screen, demanding an encryption key. I did not have to guess. I simply opened the worn leather-bound ledger my grandfather had included in the briefcase. On the very first page, written in his precise angular script, was a sequence of alphanumeric codes disguised as old shipping vessel registration numbers. I typed the first sequence into the prompt, hitting the enter key. The screen turned vibrant green, and a massive directory of files immediately populated my desktop. I repeated the process with the remaining 3 drives, transferring gigabytes of raw financial data directly onto my local hard drive. What lay before me was the unfiltered truth of the Elijah Holdings empire. It was a staggering data dump encompassing 5 years of corporate ledgers, profit and loss statements, internal audits, and board meeting minutes. This was the raw data before the accountants polished it, before the defense lawyers redacted it, and long before my family ever saw the sanitized executive summaries. I spent the next 4 hours submerged in the complex numbers. The sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, plunging my apartment into shadows, but I did not turn on a single light. The glow of my monitor was all the illumination I needed. I started by cross-referencing the official tax returns of the logistics company with the operational profits recorded in my grandfather's ledger. At first glance, everything seemed perfectly aligned. Apex Capital had done an immaculate job of making the holding company appear robust and profitable. But my grandfather had told me to watch Connor. He told me to follow the money. So I stopped looking at the main arteries of the corporation and started examining the capillaries. I opened a restricted folder labeled Apex Capital Dispersals. This was the master record of every single dollar Connor's venture capital firm had supposedly reinvested into our supply chain infrastructure and commercial fleet upgrades over the last 36 months. I pulled up the corresponding vendor invoices on my second monitor. It took me less than 20 minutes to spot the first glaring anomaly. I found an approved invoice for $3.5 million allocated to a shell corporation for automated warehouse routing software. I dug into the background of the Shell Corporation using public registry databases. It was registered in Delaware with nothing more than a post office box for an address. I traced the routing numbers attached to the wire transfer. The money had not gone to a legitimate software developer. It had been funneled directly into the primary operating account of Aura Vita. Aura Vita was Aaliyah's supposedly wildly successful luxury lifestyle and wellness brand. My jaw tightened as I opened another file and traced a second massive transfer. $4.2 million earmarked for international maritime freight insurance had been quietly rerouted through shell companies to cover Aura Vita's disastrous manufacturing debts in Southeast Asia. The realization hit me with absolute clarity. Connor had not been managing our family assets at all. He had been systematically and aggressively embezzling millions of dollars from my grandfather's logistics company. Aaliyah's entire wellness empire was a complete fabrication. Her organic skincare lines, her boutique meditation studios, her endless promotional tours, and her lavish influencer parties. None of it was generating a single dime of legitimate profit. Her business was a catastrophic failure, hemorrhaging millions of dollars every single quarter. But my parents could never accept a public failure from their golden child. And Connor could certainly not afford the professional embarrassment of his own wife, bankrupting a highly publicized startup while he claimed to be a genius venture capitalist. So he used his unchecked position at Apex Capital to bleed my grandfather's logistics company completely dry. He siphoned off millions to quietly cover Aaliyah's massive mounting debts and keep the flawless illusion of her brilliant entrepreneurial success alive for the cameras. He cooked the corporate books, faked the vendor invoices, and manipulated the quarterly reports to hide the massive financial hole he was tearing into our generational family wealth. This was the real reason Connor had looked like he was going to vomit right there in the mahogany boardroom. This was exactly why he had tried to physically block the door and aggressively bully me into signing a legal waiver for a pathetic $50,000. He knew with certainty that the second I took control of the holding company, I would have the legal authority to open the corporate books. He knew I possessed the intelligence to find the missing millions. I leaned back in my desk chair, staring up at the dark ceiling of my apartment. My grandfather had known absolutely everything. He had quietly watched Connor bleeding his life's work dry. He had watched my parents eagerly enable the massive fraud prioritizing their country club image and Aaliyah's fake success over the actual survival of the legitimate family business. But Grandpa Elijah was trapped by their collective delusion. If he had exposed Connor while he was still alive, my parents would have fiercely protected the golden child. They would have hired expensive defense lawyers to bury the scandal, settle the debts, and spin a public narrative that protected the pristine family name. The toxic rot would have remained intact. So Grandpa Elijah did what he always did best. He played the brilliant long game. He silently gathered every shred of damning evidence, every forged vendor invoice, every illegally routed bank transfer, and he locked it safely inside a battered black leather briefcase. He completely bypassed his superficial wife, his weak son, and his fraudulent golden granddaughter. He left the ultimate keys to the kingdom to the one person in the entire family who was completely immune to their toxic obsession with public image. He left his legacy to the designated scapegoat. He knew I would never accept a cheap bribe. He knew I would never sweep a felony under the rug just to save Aaliyah's unearned reputation. He gave me the Master Holding Corporation, not just to reward my independent hard work, but to make me the ultimate executioner. He had secretly armed me with the exact high-yield weapon I needed to strip my parents of their protective enabler status and send my arrogant brother-in-law straight to a federal penitentiary. A deep, satisfying warmth spread through my chest as I realized the profound level of trust my grandfather had placed upon my shoulders. I sat forward, cracking my knuckles, and cracked open an energy drink. I was not finished. If I was going to hand this data dump over to the federal authorities and the Securities Exchange Commission, I needed to trace every stolen cent to its final destination. I opened a new spreadsheet and began meticulously mapping the complex web of shell companies and offshore transfers Connor had constructed. For the next 3 hours, I followed a convoluted money trail that bounced from Atlanta to the Cayman Islands to Luxembourg and back to the United States. I accounted for $16 million funneled directly into Aura Vitas, failing accounts saving Aaliyah from bankruptcy. But as I tallied the final column, a glaring discrepancy emerged. Connor had embezzled a total of $21 million from the logistics company. There was an untraceable $5 million completely unaccounted for. It had not gone to Aaliyah's brand. It had not gone back into Apex Capital. I isolated the routing numbers tied to the missing $5 million. I traced the sequence through a secondary offshore account registered under Connor's personal identification number. The money was not being used to pay off Aaliyah's business debts. It was being automatically dispersed in monthly increments to a luxury real estate trust based in downtown Atlanta. I hacked into the county property tax database and pulled the deed for the trust address. It was a high-rise penthouse located in the most exclusive zip code in the city. I scrolled down to the bottom of the document, expecting to see Connor's name listed as the primary beneficiary. Instead, the mortgage payments, the property taxes, and the homeowners association fees were all being funded by Connor's hidden account, but the property itself was legally deeded to someone else. I stared at the glowing screen, my breath hitching in my throat, as I read the name listed on the deed. It was not Aaliyah. It was not a corporate entity. The luxury penthouse was registered exclusively under the name Elena Rostova, a woman I had never heard of in my life. I stared at the glowing screen, my breath hitching in my throat, as I read the name listed on the deed. Elena Rostova. The name echoed in the quiet of my apartment, a phantom variable in the mathematical equation of my family betrayal. I did not have time to process the magnitude of this discovery because a sharp, heavy pounding suddenly rattled my front door. The knocks were not polite. They were aggressive and demanding, echoing through the corridor with an undeniable sense of authority. I immediately closed the laptop screen, severing the connection to the encrypted flash drives. I slid the drives and the leather-bound ledger back into the black briefcase, securing the brass latches with a solid click. I shoved the briefcase under the dining table, pushing it deep into the shadows before walking toward the entryway. I checked the security peephole. My father, Terrence, stood in the hallway, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set in a rigid line of barely suppressed fury. He was wearing his signature charcoal gray tailored suit, but his tie was slightly loosened, betraying a rare crack in his immaculate presentation. I unlocked the deadbolt and slid the heavy security chain free. Before I could even speak a word of greeting, my father pushed his way past me, forcing the door wide open with a rough shove of his hand. He did not wait for an invitation to enter. He marched directly into my living space, exuding an aura of absolute ownership. He carried a massive leather-bound legal binder under his right arm. The thick stack of papers inside looked heavy enough to act as a weapon. He bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight for the kitchen island, slamming the massive binder down onto the pristine granite countertop. The loud thud echoed off the high ceilings of my apartment. He turned to face me, his dark eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not mention the malicious eviction notice plastered on my office door or the brutal smear campaign my mother was currently waging against me across the city of Atlanta. He skipped the pleasantries entirely. "This ends tonight, Jasmine." He ordered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated with absolute authority. "You have had your fun playing the victim and parading around with your grandfather's briefcase, but the game is over." I stood my ground near the entryway, refusing to shrink under his towering presence. I crossed my arms over my chest, maintaining a steady, unblinking gaze. "I am not playing a game, Dad," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I am managing the legal inheritance that Grandpa Elijah explicitly left to me." My father scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped against the quiet room. He reached out and slapped his large palm flat against the cover of the legal binder resting on the granite island. "This is a drafted lawsuit," he announced. "It was prepared this afternoon by Connor's elite legal team at Apex Capital. If you do not surrender the Master Holding Corporation by the end of the week, this binder goes straight to a federal judge. We are filing formal charges against you for corporate espionage, financial sabotage, and felony elder abuse." I felt a cold, sharp laugh rising in the back of my throat, but I swallowed it down. "Elder abuse," I repeated, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "You are accusing me of elder abuse after Mom just spent the entire afternoon telling my clients that I am a mentally unstable thief." My father took a menacing step forward, pointing a rigid finger directly at my face. "You manipulated a dying man, Jasmine. You exploited your grandfather's failing cognitive state to coerce him into signing over the family legacy. Connor has 3 corporate psychiatrists willing to testify that Elijah lacked the legal mental capacity to execute a binding contract during his final months. They will testify that you exercised undue influence over a vulnerable senior citizen. On top of that, Connor's legal team has drafted a motion to seize all of your digital devices. They are going to prove that you engaged in corporate espionage by accessing Apex Capital networks without authorization." The sheer level of projection was staggering. Connor was the one actively embezzling millions of dollars from the logistics company to fund offshore accounts and luxury penthouses for mysterious women. But they were going to sue me for corporate espionage. They were prepared to drag my grandfather's brilliant legacy through the mud, painting him as a senile invalid, just to protect Connor's fraudulent venture capital firm and Aaliyah's fake wellness empire. My father leaned heavily against the kitchen island, his dark eyes boring into mine. "Stop being difficult, Jasmine," he growled, his tone dripping with condescension. "You have always done this. You have always been stubborn and contrarian, just like you were when you refused to join the family business after college. You always had to prove you were smarter than the rest of us by running off to start your little public relations gig instead of accepting the position I offered you. You could never just be a team player." I stared at him, letting his words wash over me. He was rewriting history again. He had never offered me a meaningful position in the family business. He had offered me a glorified administrative role, managing his calendar and fetching his coffee, while Connor and Aaliyah were handed executive titles and 6-figure salaries straight out of graduate school. I refused to join the family business because I refused to be their permanent subordinate. "I am offering you a clean exit," my father continued, misinterpreting my silence as hesitation. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, white envelope, tossing it onto the counter next to the massive legal binder. "There is a certified cashier's check in that envelope for $50,000. It is a completely tax-free payout. You sign the legal waiver transferring your voting shares to Connor, and you walk away with the cash tonight. No lawsuits, no public scandals, no media circus. We wipe the slate clean and you go back to running your little consulting firm." I looked at the white envelope resting on the granite surface. $50,000. It was the exact same insulting amount Connor had offered me in the mahogany boardroom just hours earlier. They genuinely believed I was desperate enough or intimidated enough to sell an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars for the price of a mid-range sedan. Take the money, Jasmine, my father urged, his voice softening into a patronizing imitation of paternal concern. Connor knows how to handle these assets. You do not. You have no idea how commercial freight logistics operate. You do not understand supply chain patents or international venture capital investments. Connor has the elite pedigree, the aggressive mindset, and the corporate infrastructure to manage this level of wealth. You are out of your depth. If you try to run this holding company, you will bankrupt the entire family within 6 months. Let the professionals handle the heavy lifting. I felt the phantom weight of the encrypted flash drives resting in the briefcase under my dining table. Connor was not a professional. He was a parasite. He was a common thief hiding behind a custom-tailored suit and an Ivy League degree. He was actively destroying the family wealth to cover his tracks and fund his illicit lifestyle with Elena Rostova. My father was standing in my kitchen demanding that I hand over the keys to the vault to the exact man who was robbing them blind. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the kitchen island. I reached out and picked up the crisp white envelope. I held it between my fingers, feeling the smooth texture of the expensive paper. My father smiled, a smug, victorious expression settling over his features. He thought he had won. He thought the heavy legal binder and the threat of public ruin had finally broken my spirit. I looked him directly in the eyes. I did not blink. I tore the envelope in half. The thick paper ripped with a loud, satisfying sound. I placed the two torn halves of the $50,000 check gently onto the granite countertop, right on top of Connor's massive legal binder. I am not signing it, I said quietly. If Connor wants to sue, he can try. But tell him that audits work both ways. My father sneered. You have 48 hours before we ruin you publicly, he snapped. He turned and walked away, but dropped a gold invitation on my table first. It was for the upcoming Elijah Legacy Gala, an event to announce Connor as the new chief executive officer. I picked it up and smiled. The war was now officially on. Watch me. The heavy gold cardstock of the Elijah Legacy Gala invitation sat on my kitchen island, a glaring symbol of my family's absolute arrogance. I shifted my gaze to the massive legal binder Terrence had left behind. Connor and his elite team of corporate sharks genuinely believed they could bury me under expensive litigation. They wanted to drag me into civil court where their endless financial resources could bleed me dry. A civil battle over corporate espionage and elder abuse would take years to resolve. They would petition a judge to freeze the Master Holding Corporation assets, rendering my grandfather's brilliant maneuver completely useless. They would drown me in discovery motions and legal fees until I was forced to surrender out of financial exhaustion. I picked up the heavy binder and tossed it directly into the trash bin. I was not going to fight Connor in a civil courtroom where his high-priced attorneys controlled the narrative. If you hold a smoking gun, you do not hand it over to a mediator. You hand it over to the authorities. I walked to my laptop, extracted the encrypted flash drives, and slipped them into a steel lockbox. I did not need an expensive corporate defense attorney. I needed a federal auditor. During my early years building my public relations firm, I managed a crisis campaign for a whistleblower. That campaign connected me with high-level operatives within the federal government. One of those contacts was an elite forensic accountant named Marcus Thorne. Marcus worked for the Federal Auditing Division, specializing in massive corporate embezzlement and offshore tax evasion. He was ruthless, meticulous, and immune to the political pressure my father and Connor relied upon to make problems disappear. I grabbed my coat and headed out the door, bypassing my personal vehicle. I walked 3 blocks and hailed a taxi, paying in cash to ensure my movements could not be tracked. I met Marcus at a crowded coffee shop in the financial district. The morning rush hour provided the perfect cover of noise and anonymity. Marcus was sitting in a corner booth, his eyes scanning the room with practiced efficiency. I slid into the booth and placed the lockbox on the table. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I looked him dead in the eye and told him exactly what I uncovered. I outlined the fake vendor invoices, the shell companies, and the international maritime freight insurance payments being funneled directly into Aaliyah's failing luxury lifestyle brand. I explained the offshore accounts and the penthouse registered to Elena Rostova. Marcus listened in absolute silence. When I finished speaking, he pulled the lockbox across the table and placed it into his leather briefcase. He told me the federal auditing process required absolute discretion. The moment they opened an inquiry, my family would be under covert surveillance. If I confronted them or alerted the media, the investigation could be compromised. He gave me one strict directive. I had to go home and remain completely silent. The waiting game was psychological torture. For the next 3 weeks, I maintained an absolute media blackout. I did not issue a single press release from my firm. I did not respond to the barrage of hostile emails from my mother. I ignored the taunting text messages from my sister. I instructed my executive assistant Maya to keep our physical office permanently closed and forward all business inquiries to a generic holding message. To the outside world, it looked exactly like I had finally broken under their immense pressure. It looked like the scapegoat had crawled into a hole to hide from their superior power. My calculated silence fed directly into their massive egos. They interpreted my lack of retaliation as a complete surrender. Without my pushback, they became incredibly sloppy and blatantly arrogant. They genuinely believed they had won the war without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom. Their arrogance was broadcast across every social media platform. I watched the digital spectacle unfold from the quiet sanctuary of my apartment, my laptop serving as my only window into their delusional reality. Aaliyah was in her element, capitalizing on the fake narrative our mother had carefully constructed. She posted daily tearful updates about how difficult this family transition had been, subtly reinforcing the lie that I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown. The fake tears quickly transitioned into pure, unadulterated vanity. The Elijah Legacy Gala was rapidly approaching, and Aaliyah treated it like a coronation. She posted endless photographs of her dress fittings twirling in a silk gown. The captions were nauseatingly smug. She wrote about stepping into a new era of family leadership and supporting her brilliant husband as he took the helm of the Elijah empire. She tagged Connor's venture capital firm in every single post, driving traffic to the exact entity currently funding her stolen lifestyle. Connor was equally emboldened by my silence. He began making aggressive public moves, confident his tracks were covered. He gave a high-profile interview discussing his visionary plans to modernize the logistics company. He spoke arrogantly about streamlining the supply chain and trimming the excess fat. Reading his quotes made my blood boil. The excess fat he was referring to was the legitimate, hardworking staff my grandfather had employed for decades. Connor was planning to gut the company to further mask the massive financial hole he had created. Terrence was photographed playing golf with prominent city officials, laying the political groundwork for Connor's formal ascension. They were all celebrating a victory built entirely on stolen money and fragile lies. The urge to blow the whistle and publicly humiliate them was overwhelming, but I remembered Marcus Thorne's strict directive. I had to let the federal snare close completely before making my final move. The wait finally broke on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my dining table nursing a cold cup of coffee when my encrypted burner phone violently buzzed. The caller identification displayed a restricted number. I answered the call immediately, pressing the device against my ear. Marcus Thorne did not bother with a greeting. His voice was sharp-clipped and laced with professional adrenaline. He told me I needed to sit down. I told him I was already seated and demanded to know what his forensic accounting team had found. Marcus confirmed that every single thing I had mapped out on my spreadsheet was entirely accurate. The federal auditors traced the fake vendor invoices directly to Aaliyah's failing wellness empire. They had identified the offshore accounts and secured the financial records tying Connor to the luxury penthouse belonging to Elena Rostova. The multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme was absolutely real and undeniable. Connor was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. But that was not the reason Marcus was calling me on a restricted line. The federal investigation had dug much deeper than the initial data dump I provided. While tearing through Apex Capital's ledgers, the auditors had uncovered a secondary financial maneuver that Connor had executed just hours after my grandfather's funeral. Marcus paused, letting the weight of his upcoming words settle over the secure line. He explained that Connor had realized the sheer magnitude of the missing $21 million could not be hidden forever. Even with shell companies, the structural deficit was mathematically impossible to mask. Connor needed a massive influx of clean, legitimate capital to balance the corporate books and essentially cover his tracks before any external audits could be triggered. He needed a pristine financial asset to serve as collateral against the stolen funds. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white as Marcus delivered the final blow. Connor had not used his own venture capital funds to plug the hole. He had used my family. According to the federal auditors, Connor had quietly leveraged the entire $7.2 million liquid cash inheritance my grandfather had left directly to my parents in Aaliyah. He had convinced my father to temporarily sign over the control of those specific trust accounts under the guise of a high-yield, short-term investment strategy through Apex Capital. My father, blinded by his absolute faith in Connor's elite financial pedigree, had handed over the keys to the family vault without a single question. Connor had instantly frozen the $7.2 million, legally binding it as collateral against the fraudulent debts he had accrued. My parents and my sister thought they were walking into the Elijah Legacy Gala as royalty. They thought they secured their generational wealth and successfully crushed the family's scapegoat. But they were completely bankrupt. The federal authorities were preparing to seize every single asset tied to Apex Capital. Because Connor used their specific inheritance to financially insulate his crimes, their entire cash payout was legally tied to a federal fraud investigation. My grandfather had not just given me the tools to destroy Connor, he had arranged the board so my toxic family would willingly hand over their own financial execution. The sheer gravity of what my grandfather had engineered settled over me like a heavy velvet cloak. He had not just handed me a shield, he had handed me the detonator. I spent the next 24 hours locked inside my apartment, reviewing the federal auditor's timeline and finalizing my strategy. The silence from my end was doing exactly what Marcus predicted. It was driving my family into a state of blissful, unchecked arrogance. My phone screen lit up on Thursday morning, exactly 2 days before the Elijah Legacy Gala. The caller identification displayed Connor's direct line at Apex Capital. I let the device vibrate against the granite island for 3 long rings before sliding the green button and raising the phone to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I just listened to the heavy, self-important breathing on the other end of the line. Connor cleared his throat, a sound dripping with unearned authority and casual condescension. "Jasmine," he began, his tone echoing the hollow confidence of a man who coasted on legacy admissions and country club handshakes. "I am glad you are finally answering your phone. Terrence tells me you threw a bit of a tantrum." He chuckled, a sharp grating noise that vibrated against my eardrum. "Ripping up $50,000 checks and refusing to sign standard corporate waivers. It was incredibly dramatic. Very typical of your usual behavior." I kept my breathing perfectly steady, maintaining absolute silence. My refusal to engage only fueled his arrogant monologue. "Look," he continued, shifting into a tone of faux paternal concern, "I am calling because I want to extend an olive branch. We are family after all, and frankly, it is getting embarrassing watching you flounder like this. Your mother tells me your public relations firm is failing. It is practically dead in the water right now. Vendors are canceling contracts. Major corporate clients are walking away. You are entirely out of options, Jasmine. The reality is that you played a stupid game and you lost." I stared at the blank wall of my kitchen, letting his profound ignorance wash over me. He genuinely believed my mother had successfully destroyed my livelihood. He had absolutely no idea that I had proactively shut down my own firm to clear the blast radius for the federal investigation. "Here is how this weekend is going to smoothly work," Connor stated coldly. "You are going to bring that battered vintage briefcase to the gala on Saturday night. You will walk in through the hotel's service entrance to avoid the society photographers and the financial press. You will hand those flash drives directly to my head of corporate security. Then you will take a designated seat at a table in the very back of the ballroom. You will smile for the cameras and clap politely while I deliver my keynote address accepting the position of Chief Executive Officer. You need to let the adults handle the heavy lifting from here on out now. The sheer audacity of his demands sent a cold, sharp thrill of anticipation straight down my spine. He was standing directly on top of a federal landmine lecturing me about handling heavy lifting. If you do this quietly and cooperatively, Connor added, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial register, I am willing to overlook your pathetic attempt at corporate espionage. In fact, I am willing to offer you a substantial lifeline. We currently need a new administrative coordinator at Apex Capital. The pay is strictly entry-level, but it comes with full corporate benefits and a dental insurance plan package. You can answer the multi-line phones, schedule my executive meetings, and coordinate the office catering. It is a highly stable job, Jasmine. Something you desperately need right now given your current financial freefall. Think of it as a generous favor from your older brother. My grip on the phone tightened, but my voice remained incredibly soft and submissive when I finally spoke. You want me to fetch your coffee, Connor? Yes, he replied without a single ounce of hesitation or irony. It is honest work. It will build character, and it will keep you completely out of our way. I let a heavy, defeated sigh escape my lips perfectly, acting the part of the broken scapegoat, finally surrendering to the Golden family. Fine, I whispered, injecting my voice with manufactured exhaustion. You win, Connor. I will bring the briefcase to the hotel on Saturday night. I will hand over the holding company documents. Just tell Mom to call off her society friends. I cannot take the public humiliation anymore. Connor laughed, a victorious booming sound that echoed through the phone speaker. I knew you would eventually see reason, Jasmine. Be at the loading dock at exactly 7 o'clock sharp. Do not be late and do not wear anything that draws attention. We want the focus entirely on Aaliyah and me. I ended the call without another word. The instant the screen went black, the submissive posture melted from my shoulders, replaced by a surge of pure, calculated adrenaline. I tossed the burner phone onto the kitchen island and grabbed my secure, encrypted laptop. Feigning total defeat was the absolute easiest part of my strategy. Connor wanted me to sit in the back of the room and watch him claim his unearned crown. I was going to do much more. I was going to give him the most unforgettable coronation in Atlanta history. I opened a highly secured communication application, bypassing standard cellular networks. I typed in a complex numerical sequence connecting directly to a private server hosted in Eastern Europe. The contact on the other end was a brilliant underground information technology specialist named Silas. I had utilized Silas during several high-stakes crisis management campaigns when corporate clients needed digital footprints scrubbed or hostile network breaches traced. Silas operated entirely in the shadows, answering only to heavy encrypted wire transfers and absolute strict operational discretion. The connection synchronized. Silas answered via text interface, his avatar, a blank black square. You are active early today, Jasmine. What is the target? I did not waste time with pleasantries. I need complete unrestricted access to the audiovisual network at the Grand Sovereign Hotel. For this Saturday night, I typed, my fingers flying across the quiet keyboard. I need you to bypass their internal security firewalls and grant me remote hijacking capabilities for the main ballroom projection screens and the surround sound speaker systems. A pulsing cursor blinked on my screen for 10 seconds before Silas replied. The Grand Sovereign facility utilizes a closed-circuit enterprise network. It is highly secure. Breaking through their primary firewall will require specific access codes or a physical bridge. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. During my tenure as a leading public relations consultant, I had organized 3 separate charity galas at the Grand Sovereign Hotel. My firm had retained the master architectural blueprints, the service elevator schematics, and the digital network access protocols for their entire event space. I scanned the comprehensive documents into a secure file and transmitted the heavy data packet directly through the encrypted application. File received. Silas confirmed a minute later. These are the master audiovisual codes. You practically handed me the keys to their digital kingdom. How much control do you require during the event? Absolute control. I typed back, my eyes locked on the monitor. I want the ability to override whatever presentation they are running on the main stage. I want to cast my own video and audio files directly from my laptop to every single monitor and speaker inside that ballroom. I want their microphones disabled entirely the exact second my digital presentation suddenly begins broadcasting on the giant screens. I can execute the network override and the audio-visual hijacking without any issues, Silas responded. But engaging a hard electronic lock on those doors violates several major building safety codes. If I lock those doors, I will trigger a silent alarm that instantly alerts the local authorities. I smiled, a cold, hard expression that mirrored the dark screen. Trigger the alarm, Silas. I want the authorities walking into that ballroom exactly 5 minutes after I take over the screens. Prepare the network bridge and send me the executable command file by tomorrow morning. I am wiring your standard premium fee, plus a 50% bonus for the rapid turnaround. I closed the encrypted application and powered down the laptop. The silent alarm would trap Connor and my parents in the room, forcing them to watch the absolute destruction of their flawless public image. It would also guarantee that Marcus Thorne and his federal auditing team could walk straight into the venue and place Connor in handcuffs before he had any opportunity to flee. I picked up the gold-embossed gala invitation from the counter, running my thumb over the elegant lettering. They wanted me to sit quietly in the back. The humid Atlanta night air clung to the tinted windows of my hired car as we pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the Grand Sovereign Hotel. The valet line was a slow-moving river of imported luxury vehicles. Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and custom-armored SUVs idled under the brilliant crystal chandeliers of the main portico. I paid the driver in cash and stepped out onto the polished marble pavement. Connor had explicitly instructed me to use the service entrance near the loading dock. He wanted me slipping through the damp concrete service corridors like an ashamed employee hiding from the cameras and the society reporters. Instead, I walked directly up the grand sweeping staircase toward the main lobby entrance. The heavy glass doors were held open by white-gloved attendants who nodded respectfully as I passed. I was not wearing the subdued and visible attire Connor had demanded. I had chosen a striking, impeccably tailored crimson suit. The vibrant blood-red fabric was cut with razor-sharp precision, clinging to my frame like a second skin. It was a suit designed to command absolute attention. It was the armor of an apex predator stepping into a room full of unsuspecting prey. I carried my grandfather's battered black leather briefcase in my right hand. The worn leather and scuffed brass latches stood out aggressively against my flawless high-fashion silhouette. I ignored the curious glances of the hotel patrons and bypassed the coat check, walking with a measured, predatory grace toward the grand ballroom. My heels clicked a steady rhythmic warning against the imported Italian marble floors. The heavy mahogany doors to the main event space stood wide open, flanked by towering floral arrangements of white orchids and silver branches. I crossed the threshold and stepped into the breathtaking opulence of the Elijah Legacy Gala. The ballroom was completely packed with the absolute upper echelon of Atlanta's elite. Mayors, city council members, prominent real estate developers, and heavy-hitting corporate investors mingled under the cascading light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in black ties glided smoothly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and delicate caviar appetizers. The entire room was meticulously designed to project an immaculate illusion of limitless generational wealth and absolute black excellence. A massive digital banner spanned the back wall, displaying the Apex Capital logo, intertwined with my grandfather's historic corporate crest. A smooth jazz quartet played softly in the background, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the high society networking. I scanned the massive room and easily spotted my family holding court near the front stage. They looked like American royalty, perfectly posed and entirely fake. My mother Denise was wearing an intricate silver gown, laughing flawlessly at a joke told by a state senator. My father Terence stood beside her, projecting the image of a proud, retiring patriarch. Connor stood in the direct center of the power circle, holding a glass of scotch and accepting premature congratulations with a practiced, humble smile. And then there was Aaliyah. My sister was absolutely dripping in borrowed diamonds. The heavy stones sparkled violently at her throat and wrists, catching the chandelier light with every calculated toss of her hair. She wore a custom silk gown that undoubtedly cost more than the average yearly salary of my grandfather's warehouse employees. She was playing the role of the ultimate supportive corporate wife, completely oblivious to the fact that her fraudulent lifestyle was the exact reason her husband was about to face federal prison. I did not skirt the edges of the room or look for the dark shadows. I walked directly down the center aisle, cutting a vibrant crimson path straight through the sea of monotonous black tuxedos and silver evening gowns. Heads began to turn as I passed. The quiet hum of polite conversation dipped slightly as the elite guests noticed the striking woman in red carrying a battered vintage briefcase. They did not know who I was, but they recognized power when it walked into a room. I kept my gaze locked dead ahead, refusing to acknowledge the murmurs and the pointing fingers. It took my mother exactly 45 seconds to spot me. I watched the flawless society smile instantly melt off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She whispered something urgent to Terence before abandoning the state senator mid-sentence. Denise moved through the crowd with alarming speed, her silver gown swishing aggressively around her ankles. She intercepted me halfway down the center aisle, physically blocking my path to the front stage. Her eyes were wide with fury, and her perfectly manicured hands were actually trembling with rage. She leaned in close, her expensive perfume failing to mask the sour scent of her absolute panic. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Jasmine?" my mother hissed, her voice dropping into a venomous, frantic whisper. "Connor explicitly told you to use the service elevator. He told you to wear black and sit in the back. Why are you wearing that ridiculous red suit? You look like a desperate attention-seeking clown." She reached out and grabbed my upper arm, her long acrylic nails digging painfully into the expensive crimson fabric of my sleeve. She tried to physically pull me toward the side exit leading to the kitchen corridors. "Stop embarrassing us," Denise demanded, her voice trembling with suppressed hysteria. "Everyone is staring at you. You are going to ruin Connor's big night with your petty jealousy. You need to turn around right now and walk to the overflow section near the service doors. There is a small table reserved for you behind the structural pillars where the photographers cannot see you. You will sit down, you will keep your mouth completely shut, and you will hand that stupid briefcase to the security team when they come to collect it. If you cause a scene tonight, I swear to God, I will personally make sure you never work in this city again. You are a complete liability to this family, and I will not let your mental instability destroy our legacy." I looked down at the hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch, and I did not pull away quickly. I simply stared at her manicured fingers with an expression of profound, clinical disgust. I slowly raised my free hand and brushed her fingers off my crimson sleeve with a smooth, deliberate motion. I swatted her away as if she were a mild annoyance, rather than the terrifying matriarch who had controlled my entire existence. My mother stumbled back a fraction of an inch, her mouth falling open in genuine shock. She had never experienced me brushing off her physical control. I stepped into her personal space, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "I am not here to sit, Mom," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly calm register that cut right through the ambient noise of the ballroom. "I am not here to hide in the shadows, and I am certainly not here to protect the fragile egos of a family of thieves." I adjusted my grip on the heavy brass handle of my grandfather's briefcase. "I am here to close a deal." I stepped around her frozen form, leaving her entirely speechless in the middle of the crowded aisle. I resumed my march toward the front stage, my crimson suit blazing under the bright focal lights. I saw Connor spot me from the power circle. His smug, confident smile instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, stormy scowl of pure rage. He nudged Terence urgently, pointing a rigid finger in my direction. My father snapped his head toward me, his posture instantly stiffening into an aggressive stance. I could see the furious calculations running behind his eyes as he desperately tried to figure out how to stop the rogue element he thought he had completely crushed. But it was far too late for quiet interventions or private threats. The stage manager was already giving the signal. The smooth jazz music abruptly faded into silence, and the massive digital screens flanking the podium flashed brightly, illuminating the entire room with the Apex Capital insignia. The high society crowd fell into a hushed, expectant silence, turning their collective attention toward the front of the ballroom. Terence smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo and marched heavily up the carpeted stairs to the main stage. He stepped behind the clear acrylic podium, adjusting the microphone with a practiced, authoritative tap. I reached the very front row, standing dead center, just below the podium. I planted my feet firmly onto the carpet, resting the black leather briefcase directly onto the edge of the stage. I looked up at my father, maintaining absolute, unyielding eye contact. Terence glared down at me, his broad chest heaving slightly as he slowly cleared his throat and leaned heavily into the shiny silver microphone to finally begin the incredibly grand ceremony. Terence gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium with both hands, leaning forward to project absolute authority. The bright spotlights reflected off his perfectly slicked hair and the diamond cufflink on his left wrist, catching the light like tiny flashes of lightning. He looked out over the sea of Atlanta elite, letting the silence stretch just long enough to demand total respect. When he finally spoke, his deep baritone voice rolled through the massive ballroom speakers, wrapping the wealthy audience in a warm blanket of curated corporate nostalgia. He spoke of my grandfather's humble beginnings, weaving a completely fictionalized narrative of a family united by unwavering loyalty and tireless ambition. He painted a picture of the Elijah legacy as a pristine monument to Black excellence, conveniently omitting the sweat, the sacrifices, and the ruthless corporate betrayals that actually built the empire. I stood frozen at the base of the stage, my crimson suit a glaring beacon against the sea of black and silver evening wear, holding the battered vintage briefcase tightly at my side. I watched the rapt faces of the state senators, the venture capitalists, and the real estate moguls, completely hypnotized by my father's practiced charisma. Terence expertly transitioned his speech from the nostalgic past to the bright, limitless future. He spoke at length about the necessity of fresh vision, the vital importance of modernizing the logistics supply chain, and the critical need for bold, aggressive leadership in a shifting global market. He called Connor a visionary. He called him a relentless innovator who possessed the exact financial pedigree required to elevate Apex Capital to unprecedented international heights. The sheer volume of lies cascading from the podium was suffocating, but the audience swallowed every single word with eager anticipation. As Terence raised his right hand in a dramatic sweeping gesture welcoming his brilliant son to the stage, the massive ballroom erupted in thunderous, deafening applause. Connor stepped out from the stage wings, striding toward the podium with the swagger of a conquering emperor returning from a glorious campaign. He adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket, flashing a dazzling, arrogant smile that showcased his perfectly veneered teeth to the flashing cameras of the society press. He shook Terrence's hand, a firm, masculine grasp, designed specifically to look powerful on the front page of the financial newspapers the next morning. Aaliyah was standing near the very front tables, clapping so hard, her heavy diamond bracelets clattered together violently, her face glowing with absolute unearned triumph. Connor stepped up to the microphone, gripping the podium exactly as our father had done, soaking in the adulation like a dry sponge. He raised his hands in a faux humble gesture, signaling for the enthusiastic applause to die down so he could deliver his historic acceptance speech. He opened his mouth, his lips parting to utter his first hollow corporate platitude. I moved before a single syllable could escape his throat. I did not wait for an invitation, and I did not hesitate. I bypassed the short carpeted stairs, entirely stepping gracefully up onto the elevated platform of the secondary soundboard, positioned just to the right of the main stage. The sound engineer, a young man with a heavy headset and a terrified expression, froze in his chair as I reached directly across his digital mixing console and grabbed the heavy wireless secondary microphone. I flicked the activation switch upward with my thumb, feeling the device hum to life in my palm. A sharp, piercing electronic feedback whine crackled briefly through the ballroom, immediately overriding the ambient noise and drawing every eye in the room to the woman in the striking red suit. Actually, Connor will not be accepting anything. My voice echoed like a thunderclap through the massive surround sound speakers. The words crashed against the crystal chandeliers and reverberated off the dark mahogany walls, instantly paralyzing every single person in the room. The thunderous applause died a sudden, violent death replaced by an eerie vacuum of sound. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of elite guests, echoing like a wave breaking against a rocky shore. The utter silence that followed was so profound and absolute that I could hear the faint mechanical hum of the air conditioning units circulating cold air high above us. Connor jerked his head toward me, his arrogant smile instantly shattering into a rigid mask of pure, unfiltered shock. Terrence spun around, his eyes widening with a volatile mixture of fury and disbelief. Denise, who was standing near the front tables, let out a sharp, audible gasp, pressing both hands against her chest, as if she had been physically struck by a heavy stone. Jasmine, Terrence barked, leaning aggressively into the main microphone, his voice dripping with paternal menace and barely contained rage. "Put the microphone down right now. You are making an absolute fool of yourself in front of our most important investors." I kept my gaze locked entirely on Connor, ignoring my father completely. Connor was staring at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly as panic finally began to override his profound entitlement. He gestured frantically to the side of the massive room, pointing directly at the exit doors. "Security," he snapped into his microphone, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. "Escort her out of the building immediately. Get her out of here now." From the dark shadows of the exit doors, the Grand Sovereign Hotel's head of corporate security stepped forward, followed closely by 3 heavily built guards in dark, tailored suits. They moved with swift, tactical efficiency, fanning out across the front of the ballroom to surround the secondary soundboard platform where I stood. The head of security, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a coiled earpiece, reached out his hand to grab my upper arm, preparing to physically remove me from the premises. "Mom," he said firmly, his tone brokering no argument. "You need to come with us quietly right this second." I did not step back. I did not flinch or show a single ounce of fear. I slowly turned my head and looked the head of security directly in his dark eyes. I raised the wireless microphone to my lips. My tone was conversational, completely devoid of panic, yet laced with an undeniable lethal edge. "I strongly suggest you remove your hand from my sleeve," I broadcasted to the entire silent, breathless ballroom. "Unless you want to explain to your regional corporate director why you forcibly assaulted the individual who currently owns your employment contract." The security guard paused immediately, his hand hovering exactly 1 inch from my crimson jacket. His thick brow furrowed in genuine confusion as he processed my words. I turned my attention back to the massive audience, my voice projecting with absolute crystal-clear authority over the speaker system. 3 days ago, my grandfather legally transferred complete ownership of the Master Holding Corporation directly to my name. I am the sole proprietary owner of the Elijah legacy and all its associated assets. I paused, letting the immense weight of the statement settle over the breathless crowd before delivering the final lethal blow. And yesterday afternoon, the Master Holding Corporation formally acquired the commercial debt on the Grand Sovereign Hotel directly from Apex Capital. Which means, gentlemen, I looked back at the security team, my expression ice-cold and unyielding. "You work for me, and I am ordering you to stand down immediately." The head of security froze completely. He pressed a thick finger to his coiled earpiece, listening intently to a frantic, rapid-fire communication from the hotel general manager, isolated in the control room upstairs. I watched the blood slowly drain from his face, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. He swallowed hard, slowly lowering his hand and taking 2 deliberate, respectful steps backward. He nodded sharply to his team, and they instantly retreated, melting silently back into the shadows of the ballroom like ghosts. The audible gasp that swept through the crowd this time was absolutely electric, buzzing with the shock of a brutal corporate takeover unfolding right before their eyes. Connor watched his private security force abandon him, his face contorting with a desperate, cornered animal panic. He gripped the edges of the clear podium, his knuckles turning completely white from the intense pressure. The flawless illusion of his absolute control was disintegrating in real time. He looked out at the vast sea of wealthy investors, the local politicians, and the media representatives who were all staring up at him with expectant, horrified eyes. He had to salvage the narrative immediately. He had to spin the catastrophic humiliation before the donors started walking out the front doors and dialing their brokers. He forced a laugh. It was a terrible, hollow grating sound that echoed awkwardly through the dead, silent room. He leaned into his microphone, attempting to project his usual smooth, condescending charm, but a thick, heavy bead of sweat was already rolling rapidly down his left temple. "Ladies and gentlemen," Connor announced, his voice straining heavily with manufactured amusement. "Please forgive the theatrical interruption. What you are witnessing is just a little bit of passionate sibling rivalry, a classic family joke." He gestured toward me with a visibly trembling hand, forcing a smile that looked more like a painful physical grimace. My younger sister Jasmine has always had a massive flair for the dramatic. She is a brilliant public relations specialist, and she loves making a grand, unforgettable entrance. But rest assured, Apex Capital is perfectly secure, and the transition of leadership will proceed exactly as planned. Let us give her a round of applause for the highly impressive performance. He started clapping loudly, slapping his hands together in a desperate rhythm, hoping the audience would join in and drown me out with supportive noise. A few scattered, hesitant claps echoed weakly from the front tables, mostly originating from Terrence and my mother, but the vast majority of the massive room remained in dead, paralyzed silence. The elite crowd was not buying the desperate, amateurish spin. They were acutely aware that they were watching a multi-million-dollar financial empire completely collapse live on the main stage. I stared at Connor, watching the sheer, naked terror radiating outward from his dilated pupils. He was sweating profusely now, his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket suddenly looking entirely too tight and suffocating against his chest. He actually believed he could talk his way out of a massive federal indictment with a charming smile and a weak improvised joke about sibling rivalry. He thought he could still control the room with his unearned confidence. It was time to shut the entire room down. I slowly reached into the right pocket of my crimson suit jacket, wrapping my fingers securely around the small encrypted device Silas had provided me earlier that morning. It contained the executable command file that would trigger the electronic network bridge and initiate the complete digital hijacking of the Grand Sovereign Hotel systems. I looked Connor dead in the eyes, a cold, triumphant smile slowly spreading across my lips. "I am not performing, Connor," I whispered directly into the microphone, my voice dripping with absolute, undeniable venom. "I am conducting an audit." I pressed the smooth glass button on the encrypted device, holding it down firmly for 3 long, agonizing seconds. The tiny green light on the surface flashed a brilliant solid red, confirming the transmission was successful. The digital signal shot silently through the cellular network, hitting the remote Eastern European servers and instantly engaging the master audiovisual code Silas had locked into place. I lowered the microphone to my side. My part of the verbal confrontation was entirely finished. The rest of the talking would be done by the undeniable financial evidence currently loading into the system cache. I stood perfectly still on the elevated platform, the battered vintage briefcase resting heavily against my leg, waiting for the digital snare to finally snap shut. The massive digital screens flanking the main stage flickered violently. The gold and black logo of Apex Capital warped into jagged lines before snapping into a stark white background. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom as high-resolution financial ledgers materialized across the displays. The spreadsheets were damning, completely unredacted, and highlighted with bright red markers indicating structural deficits. I raised the wireless microphone to my lips, my voice projected with absolute clarity, filling the silent room. What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen, are the authentic accounting ledgers of Apex Capital. I announced, my tone completely devoid of emotion. As you can clearly see, the company Connor just accepted leadership of is operating with a $21 million deficit. The silence in the room transformed into a heavy, suffocating tension. I kept my eyes locked on the crowd, making direct eye contact with the venture capitalists who had just been applauding my brother. Connor has spent the last 18 months systematically siphoning funds from the Master Holding Corporation directly into a series of untraceable shell companies. He utilized fake vendor invoices, offshore accounts, and fictitious corporate consulting fees to mask the massive hemorrhage of your investment capital. The numbers do not lie. They are displayed right behind him for everyone to verify. Connor desperately slammed his hand against the podium microphone, attempting to shout over me, but Silas had executed his digital hijack perfectly. Connor's microphone was completely dead. He was mouthing words that no one could hear, his face turning a blotchy, dangerous shade of crimson. His mouth hung open in a pathetic silent scream as he pounded the clear acrylic stand. The arrogant golden boy was completely muted, trapped on a brightly lit stage, with the definitive, undeniable proof of his federal crimes broadcasting behind his head. The elite audience began to shift uncomfortably in their designated seats. The initial shock was rapidly evolving into genuine financial panic. Men in expensive tuxedos were pulling out their smartphones, frantically dialing their brokers and private wealth managers. The room buzzed with an escalating, frantic whisper. I directed my attention to a VIP table near the front where the primary board members of Apex Capital were seated in stunned disbelief. Their faces were pale and drained of color as they stared at the screens, reading the specific routing numbers of their drained accounts. You will notice a recurring recipient on those ledgers. I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, refusing to let the tension dissipate. The wellness and luxury lifestyle brand owned by my sister Aaliyah. Over $4 million of stolen corporate capital was funneled directly into her failing business ventures to maintain the illusion of profitability. My mother, Denise, stood frozen near the front row, her hands clutching her silver gown in absolute horror. She was watching the meticulous destruction of her carefully curated high society image broadcast live. She tried to step forward to silence me, but her legs seemed entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation. Terrence was gripping the edge of the stage, his knuckles stark white, his mouth opening and closing as he failed to comprehend the reality of the situation. He had built his entire identity on the flawless reputation of the Elijah legacy, and I was burning that legacy to ash. I tapped a button on my laptop, syncing the next set of files to the main displays. But the corporate theft was only the beginning of Connor's remarkable financial maneuvering. I stated, my voice dropping to a sharp, dangerous register. Let us take a closer look at where the rest of the missing millions actually went. The massive screens transitioned instantly. The complex financial spreadsheets vanished, replaced by a scanned image of a premium real estate deed. The property was a luxury penthouse located in the most exclusive high-rise building in the downtown financial district. The purchase price listed was $3.2 million, paid entirely in a single cash wire transfer originating from one of the Apex Capital shell companies. Right below the deed, a series of recurring wire transfers populated the bright screen. Monthly payments of $50,000 categorized as private corporate consulting fees. But the name on the deed and the routing accounts did not belong to a corporate entity or a legitimate business partner. The name glowing in massive, bold black letters across the displays was Elena Rostova. I looked directly at Connor, watching the last remaining shred of his arrogant composure completely vaporize. Elena Rostova is not an asset manager or a logistics consultant, I announced, allowing a sharp note of absolute disgust to enter my broadcast. She is Connor's long-term mistress. While he was standing on this stage accepting congratulations for his brilliant financial stewardship, he was secretly draining his investors' capital to purchase luxury real estate and fund the extravagant lifestyle of another woman. The low murmurs in the crowd instantly erupted into outright shouts of outrage and shock. Flashbulbs from the society press began firing rapidly, bathing the entire stage in blinding bursts of harsh white light. They were capturing every single bead of sweat rolling down Connor's face, every pathetic twitch of his panicked jaw. He looked exactly like a trapped animal, completely stripped of his unearned confidence and his country club armor. He had stolen from his family, he had stolen from his elite investors, and he had financed a massive domestic betrayal using their money. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the escalating, chaotic noise of the ballroom. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped from Aaliyah's trembling fingers, hitting the imported Italian marble floor and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. She stood dead center in the front row, her heavily diamond-encrusted wrists hanging limply at her sides. Her custom silk gown suddenly looked like a tragic theatrical costume draped over a broken, lifeless mannequin. She stared up at the massive digital screens, her eyes locked intensely on the name Elena Rostova and the multi-million-dollar figures attached to it. The beautiful, pristine illusion she had fiercely protected, the perfect marriage, the flawless lifestyle, the unearned generational wealth was disintegrating before her very eyes, in the most public way possible. Aaliyah let out a guttural, agonizing scream that ripped right through the heavy, suffocating air of the ballroom. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated emotional devastation. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the stage and hauling herself up the short set of carpeted stairs with a clumsy, desperate, furious energy. She charged directly toward Connor, her expensive designer heels sinking deeply into the plush carpet. Connor backed away from the podium, raising his hands in a frantic, defensive posture. "Aaliyah, please listen to me," he pleaded, his voice raw and reedy, entirely devoid of power, without the amplification of the microphone. "It is a lie. It is all a lie. She is trying to destroy us." But the irrefutable evidence was glowing brilliantly behind him, completely impossible to deny. Aaliyah slammed her fists violently against his chest, beating him with a wild, unrestrained fury. "You stole from my family!" she screamed hysterically, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, completely ruining her immaculate makeup. "You used my business. You bought her a penthouse. You disgusting, pathetic liar." Connor scrambled backward, trying to catch her flailing wrists. The cameras flashed. The entire ballroom had descended into bedlam. Terrence finally snapped out of his paralyzed stupor. His gaze snapped toward me, his dark eyes burning with murderous, unhinged rage. He blamed me for exposing the horrific rot rather than punishing the people who created it. "You treacherous, ungrateful liar!" Terrence roared, his voice cutting through the ambient noise with startling volume. He lunged across the front of the stage, moving with a terrifying, reckless speed. He vaulted over the low floral barrier, charging directly toward the secondary soundboard platform where I stood. He did not care about the optics or flashing cameras anymore. He only desperately wanted to silence the broadcast. He reached wildly for the thick black cables running from my laptop to the main console, attempting to violently rip the connections and cut my digital power. He grabbed the microphone cable, screaming that I was destroying our historic legacy. I stood my ground, holding the microphone perfectly steady, refusing to back away from his violent charge. But before his hands could tear the wires, a loud booming sound echoed from the rear of the ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors swung open violently, hitting the surrounding walls with a massive thud. The chaotic shouting instantly died down as men in dark windbreakers stepped inside. The heavy mahogany doors slamming open sent a massive shockwave through the paralyzed ballroom. Terrence froze in midair, his massive hands inches from the thick audio cables connecting my laptop to the main soundboard. The unhinged fury in his eyes instantly evaporated, replaced by a creeping primal dread, as 12 men and women wearing dark navy windbreakers fanned out across the entryways. The bright yellow letters, printed boldly across their backs, glowed under the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency, instantly securing every single exit and cutting off any possible avenue of escape. The armed agents formed a solid, impenetrable wall of federal authority, completely contrasting with the delicate white orchids and imported silk drapery. The smooth jazz quartet had long since fled the stage, leaving only the echoing sounds of heavy tactical boots marching across the imported Italian marble. Marcus Thorne stepped through the center of the formation holding a thick leather folder. His expression was a mask of absolute professional stoicism. He did not look at the wealthy politicians, the gasping venture capitalists, or the society photographers frantically snapping pictures. He walked with measured, deliberate steps directly toward the main stage, where Connor was still cowering behind the clear acrylic podium. The elite crowd parted for Marcus like the Red Sea, desperate to avoid any accidental association with the impending federal takedown. The powerful men and women who had just been applauding my brother were now shrinking back into the shadows, clutching their vintage champagne flutes in sheer terror. Connor watched Marcus approach, his face draining of whatever color remained, until he looked like a hollow wax mannequin. He took a clumsy, stumbling step backward, his expensive designer shoes tangling in the heavy fabric of the stage curtains. He looked wildly around the ballroom, searching for a friendly face, a sympathetic judge, or a corrupt politician he had paid off. He found absolutely no one. The very people who he had courted and bribed were actively turning their backs, shielding their faces from the flashing cameras. Marcus stopped at the base of the stage, staring up at the trembling golden boy of Apex Capital. Connor Elijah Thorne. Marcus announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the dead silent room without the need for a microphone. We have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with 24 counts of corporate embezzlement, interstate wire fraud, and international tax evasion. We also have secondary warrants authorizing the immediate seizure of all domestic and offshore assets tied to Apex Capital and the Master Holding Corporation. Connor gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles stark white, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. You have no jurisdiction here, he stammered, his voice a pathetic, reedy squeak. I am the chief executive officer of this company. This is a private corporate event. You cannot just walk in here and make these absurd accusations. My legal team will destroy you. I will have your badge for this. Marcus did not even blink at the empty, desperate threat. He simply raised his right hand, signaling 2 heavily armed agents to step up onto the carpeted platform. The agents flanked Connor, instantly grabbing his arms and wrenching them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the ballroom, a brutal final punctuation to the Elijah family legacy. Connor gasped in pain as the cold steel bit into his wrists, completely ruining the clean lines of his custom-tailored tuxedo. He struggled weakly, shifting his panicked gaze toward Terrence, who was still standing frozen near my soundboard platform. Dad, he pleaded, his voice cracking with sheer terror. Dad, do something. Call the governor. Call the mayor. Tell them this is a mistake. Terrence did not move a single muscle. The patriarch, who had spent decades covering up his son's massive failures, was entirely powerless against the crushing weight of federal indictments. I stepped down from the elevated platform, walking slowly across the front of the main stage, until I was standing less than 2 feet away from my handcuffed brother. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, finally realizing that he had never been the smartest person in the room. I looked at his ruined designer jacket and the heavy sweat pouring down his forehead. You told me my public relations firm was dead, Connor. I said, my voice perfectly steady and deadly calm. You laughed and offered me a pathetic entry-level job, fetching your coffee to save me from financial ruin. You told me my entire operation was not worth $2 to this family. I leaned in slightly, letting the cool, confident smile reach my eyes. You didn't want my $2, Connor, but you're definitely going to need a lawyer. The society photographers surged forward, sensing the absolute climax of the century. Their camera flashes erupted in a blinding, continuous strobe, capturing the exact moment the untouchable golden child was humiliated in front of the entire Atlanta elite. Below the stage, the situation was devolving into a catastrophic public breakdown. Aaliyah had collapsed onto the carpeted floor, her physical and emotional strength completely failing her. She lay in a heap of crumpled designer silk and shattered crystal, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. The heavy diamond necklace she had worn like a crown was twisted awkwardly around her throat, a glaring symbol of the fraudulent empire that had just burned to the ground. She clutched the fabric of her dress, weeping hysterically, as she watched the federal agents physically march her husband off the main stage. Her entire identity, her carefully constructed social media presence, her pristine luxury lifestyle brand was permanently obliterated. The society bloggers and influencers who had been eagerly documenting her glamorous outfit just 30 minutes earlier were now viciously recording her devastating collapse. They filmed her ruined makeup, the dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks, and the sheer agony of a woman realizing her entire marriage was financed by stolen money and a hidden mistress. She reached a trembling hand out toward the stage, her voice a hoarse, broken whisper as she choked on her own tears. He bought her a penthouse, she sobbed, repeating the phrase over and over again, like a broken record. He bought her a penthouse with my money. She curled into a tight fetal position on the floor, completely abandoned by the high society friends who were already scrambling toward the exits. The ballroom was a masterpiece of absolute corporate carnage. The federal agents were systematically moving through the VIP tables, securing documents, laptops, and any physical evidence tied to the Apex Capital executives. The elite guests were rushing the coat check, desperate to flee the blast radius before they were subpoenaed for questioning. I stood alone on the edge of the stage, watching the empire my grandfather had built, finally cleansed of the parasites who had infected it. The silence of the room was now replaced by the chaotic symphony of shouting reporters, crying relatives, and the stern, authoritative commands of federal law enforcement. I turned to gather my encrypted laptop and the vintage briefcase, preparing to exit the building and leave the wreckage behind forever. But before my fingers could grasp the leather handle, a frantic heavy weight slammed into my shoulder. I spun around instinctively, bracing for an attack. It was my mother. Denise looked entirely unrecognizable. Her flawless silver hair was disheveled, sticking to her damp forehead in wild, erratic strands. Her incredibly expensive gown was torn near the hem, completely ruined from her frantic sprint across the chaotic ballroom floor. She grabbed both of my arms with a desperate, bruising grip, her long acrylic nails digging frantically into my crimson suit. She was hyperventilating, her eyes wide and bloodshot, darting wildly between the flashing press cameras and the exit doors where Connor had just been dragged away in handcuffs. She completely ignored the fact that her only son was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. She ignored the fact that her youngest daughter was currently sobbing on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and ruined diamonds. Denise only saw the cameras. She only saw the total destruction of her perfect societal image. She shook my arms violently, her voice dropping into a shrill, hysterical plea that cut through the noise of the room. "Jasmine, do something! Fix this!" I looked down at her frantic face, feeling absolutely nothing but cold closure. The matriarch who had controlled our lives was reduced to begging the daughter she despised. I slowly uncurled her fingers from my jacket and stepped back, leaving her grasping at empty air. I turned away and walked calmly toward the open front doors, stepping over the shattered crystal on the floor. I walked out into the warm Atlanta night, finally free, leaving the burning wreckage of the Elijah family legacy completely behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. My mother had thrown herself directly in front of me, aggressively blocking my path to the exit doors with a desperate, frenzied energy. Denise was panting heavily, her chest heaving against the torn silk of her ruined evening gown. The sharp, ambient chaos of the ballroom, the shouting federal agents, the weeping investors, the frantic clicking of press cameras faded into a dull, distant roar. I focused entirely on the woman standing before me. For my entire 35 years of existence, this woman had looked at me with varying degrees of disappointment, thinly veiled disgust, and outright hostility. I had always been the stubborn anomaly, the defective product, that failed to meet the rigorous, superficial standards of the Elijah family manufacturing line. But right now, in the exact epicenter of this spectacular corporate apocalypse, her gaze was fundamentally different. She was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes that held a sudden, desperate reverence. She was finally looking at me like I possessed immense, invaluable worth. But I knew the absolute, uncompromising truth behind that sudden maternal desperation. She did not value me as a daughter. She did not suddenly respect my independence or admire my unyielding resilience. She only valued me because I was the final remaining life raft on a rapidly sinking ship. She saw me exclusively as a public relations weapon, the only person capable of spinning this catastrophic disaster into a survivable, palatable narrative. She desperately needed me to save her from the inescapable public humiliation that Connor had just brought down upon our perfect societal image. "Jasmine, please, you have to listen to me," Denise begged, her voice cracking with an unfamiliar, pathetic vulnerability. "You are the absolute best crisis manager in Atlanta. You know all the major editors at the business journals. You have the media contacts to bury the worst of this immediately. We can craft a statement claiming Connor acted entirely alone as a rogue element. We can tell the press the family is fully cooperating with the federal authorities and was completely unaware of his illegal financial maneuvers. We can salvage the holding company. We can save your father's legacy. You just have to step in and take control of the press narrative right this second." I stared at her manicured hands, which were still hovering anxiously in the air between us. A deep, profound silence settled over my mind entirely, replacing the lifetime of anxiety and desperate yearning for her approval. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel the crushing, suffocating weight of childhood rejection. I simply felt an immense, liberating emptiness. I looked directly into her panicked, calculating eyes and let a small, cold smile form on my lips. "No," I said. The single syllable was quiet, but it struck her with the blunt, devastating force of a physical blow. Denise blinked rapidly, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in genuine panicked confusion. "What do you mean, no?" she demanded, her voice rising an octave in hysteria. "You are a public relations expert. This is exactly what you do for a living. You fix corporate disasters. You are family Jasmine. You have an absolute duty to step up and protect us when we are under attack." "I am a public relations expert." I agreed, my tone dangerously level. "But you seem to have forgotten a very critical detail regarding my current employment status, Mom." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Over the past 4 weeks, you and Terrence spent an extraordinary amount of money and social capital systematically destroying my firm. You personally called my biggest clients and threatened to blacklist them from the country club if they continued to retain my services. You orchestrated a vicious smear campaign to ensure my corporate lease was terminated. You completely decimated the business I built from the ground up with my own 2 hands solely to force me into crawling back here and accepting a humiliating entry-level position under the brother who just bankrupted your entire future." I held her gaze, refusing to let her look away from the ugly, indisputable truth. "So, while I possess the exact skills required to handle a crisis of this magnitude, I am officially no longer available for hire." Denise opened her mouth to argue, but the words died instantly in her throat. Her face turned an ashen, sickly shade of gray as the reality of her own vindictive actions finally caught up with her. She had spent a month burning every single bridge between us, and now she was hopelessly trapped on the wrong side of the fire. I am not here to manage your crisis, Denise. I continued, my voice echoing with absolute clinical finality. I am here to finalize the transaction. I turned slightly and placed the battered black leather briefcase onto the polished surface of the nearest VIP dining table. The heavy brass latches clicked sharply as I flicked them open. The sound was crisp and loud, cutting perfectly through the surrounding ambient noise. I lifted the worn leather lid and reached inside. I bypassed the stacks of digital audits and financial ledgers that I had already exposed to the feds, pulling out a thick manila folder containing the most vital documents of the entire operation. I withdrew the crisp, heavy parchment papers and laid them out meticulously across the white linen tablecloth, right next to a shattered crystal centerpiece. My mother stepped closer, her eyes darting nervously down to the table. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling with fresh mounting apprehension. "These are the authenticated, fully executed legal documents confirming my total, unencumbered ownership of the Master Holding Corporation." I explained, smoothing the edge of the top page with my index finger. Grandfather did not leave the company to Connor. He knew exactly what Connor was doing. He transferred the entire holding company directly to me before he passed away. I own the warehouses, the logistics contracts, and every single asset tied to the original family enterprise. I paused, letting the immense weight of the revelation crush the last remnants of her arrogance. "And I also own the commercial debt on this hotel. You have absolutely nothing left to salvage." Denise stared at the prominent signatures on the legal documents, her breath hitching painfully in her throat. But the inheritance, she stammered, her eyes wide with desperate, frantic denial. "The $7.2 million liquid inheritance. We still have the private family accounts. Terrence and I have the capital to hire the absolute best defense attorneys in the state. We can fight the federal asset seizures. We have our own money." I looked at her, feeling a brief, fleeting moment of pity for the sheer, staggering depth of her ignorance. My father had kept her completely in the dark regarding the true extent of the financial rot. "Connor did not just steal from his corporate investors, Mom," I said softly, delivering the final catastrophic truth. "He was deeply entrenched in highly illegal offshore equity loans to cover his initial market losses. He needed massive capital to secure those fraudulent loans. He used the entire $7.2 million family inheritance as collateral." Denise stumbled backward, as if I had physically struck her in the chest. She grabbed the edge of the dining table to steady herself, her knuckles turning stark white. "No," she whispered, shaking her head frantically. "No, Terrence would never allow that. The family trust is legally locked." "Terrence gave Connor the primary authorization codes 3 months ago," I stated firmly, destroying her last remaining delusion. "He thought he was financing a temporary bridge loan for a brilliant corporate acquisition. He handed your entire future over to a thief. Connor defaulted on those offshore loans 6 weeks ago. The federal agents swarming this room right now are not just seizing Apex Capital assets. They have secondary warrants to seize all personal accounts connected to the fraudulent collateral." I leaned forward, resting my hands flat against the table. "The feds are freezing your private accounts, Mom. Your retirement portfolios, your country club equity, your checking accounts. It is all gone. The government is taking everything." My mother let out a low, agonizing wail. It was a sound of total, absolute destruction. The pristine, untouchable queen of Atlanta high society had just been violently stripped of her crown, her kingdom, and her entire royal treasury in the span of 15 minutes. She looked wildly around the ballroom, watching the federal agents confiscating laptops and boxing up documents. She saw Aaliyah still weeping hysterically on the floor. She saw the society photographers gleefully documenting the total ruin. She had spent her entire life worshipping money and status, and now she possessed absolutely neither. I reached slowly into the inner breast pocket of my crimson suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the crisp, textured paper I had been carrying since the moment I walked into the building. I pulled out the 2 crisp $1 bills. I held them up, letting the bright chandelier light illuminate the dark green ink. Denise stared at the money, her tear-streaked face registering total incomprehension. When I came to you for help, you laughed in my face. I reminded her, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth or sympathy. You handed me $2 and told me to take the bus home. You told me my ambitions were a pathetic joke, and that I would never amount to anything without the Elijah name. I placed the $2 bills carefully on top of the stack of legal documents, smoothing them out so they sat perfectly flat against the parchment. I looked my mother dead in the eyes, delivering the final invoice for 35 years of emotional abuse. Since Connor used the $7.2 million inheritance as collateral for his illegal loans, the feds are seizing your accounts, Mom. Go earn your own. I did not wait for a response. I did not stay to watch the final pathetic stages of her collapse. I turned my back on Denise, Terrence, Connor, Aaliyah, and the burning wreckage of the family empire. I picked up the empty vintage briefcase, feeling incredibly miraculously light. I walked with steady, measured strides toward the grand mahogany exit doors. The heavy federal presence in the room ignored me entirely. Their attention focused squarely on dismantling the massive corporate fraud unfolding around the main stage. The society press parted as I approached, stepping aside to let the woman in the striking red suit pass through the exact center of the chaos. I crossed the threshold of the ballroom, stepping out into the grand palatial foyer of the hotel. The noise of the screaming executives and the shouting agents was instantly muffled behind the heavy closing doors. I walked past the empty coat check and down the sweeping marble staircase, moving with a predatory, graceful confidence that belonged entirely to me. I pushed open the massive glass entry doors and stepped out into the humid Atlanta night. The cool evening air washed over my face, feeling incredibly clean and fresh. The sweeping circular driveway was completely chaotic. A massive fleet of dark federal vehicles with flashing blue and red lights entirely blocked the valet lane. The wail of approaching police sirens echoed loudly in the distance, tearing through the quiet sophistication of the luxury district. I stood on the polished marble pavement, listening to the sirens draw closer, knowing they were coming for the people who had tried to break me. I took a deep, cleansing breath and walked down the street, leaving the $2 on the table and never looking back. The humid night air felt entirely different now. 3 months had passed since that spectacular corporate apocalypse at the Grand Sovereign Hotel, and the landscape of Atlanta high society had been permanently, violently rearranged. The fallout from the federal raid was swift, brutal, and entirely absolute. I did not have to lift a single finger to orchestrate their final destruction. I simply stood back and allowed the natural consequences of their own insatiable greed to completely devour them. The immediate aftermath was a media spectacle. The society bloggers and financial journalists who had previously worshipped my family turned on them with vicious, relentless precision. The truth was far too scandalous to ignore. Connor was currently sitting in a maximum security federal detention center, awaiting a highly publicized trial. The government prosecutors had explicitly denied his request for bail, citing him as a severe flight risk given the sheer volume of his offshore accounts and his demonstrated capacity for international wire fraud. Without his custom Italian suits, his expensive haircuts, and his country club armor, he was just another terrified white-collar criminal facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. His elite defense attorneys had attempted to reach out to my legal team, offering a desperate plea deal. They proposed returning a fraction of the stolen capital in exchange for my public leniency and a favorable character witness statement. I forwarded their pathetic emails directly to the federal prosecutors without a single word of reply. Aaliyah experienced an equally devastating, catastrophic freefall. Her supposedly revolutionary luxury lifestyle brand went completely bankrupt, exactly 72 hours after the federal authorities froze her business accounts. The entire operation had been nothing but an extravagant hollow shell, propped up entirely by the millions Connor had systematically siphoned from my grandfather's corporate legacy. Without the stolen capital constantly paying for her imported warehouse inventory and her fake social media sponsorships, her creditors descended upon her like a pack of starving wolves. She was brutally forced to liquidate absolutely everything she owned. She sold her borrowed diamonds, her designer wardrobe, and her imported vehicles just to afford basic legal representation. The society influencers who had once coveted her every move immediately turned her public collapse into a massive cautionary tale, completely obliterating her public image overnight. But the most profound and poetic transformation occurred with my parents. Terrence and Denise lost the entire $7.2 million liquid inheritance to federal asset forfeiture. The government seized the funds to cover the massive fraudulent collateral Connor had illegally leveraged for his offshore loans. Without that vital capital, the banks moved with ruthless efficiency. They foreclosed on my parents' sprawling, palatial estate in Buckhead within 30 days. Terrence and Denise were forced to hastily auction off their vintage cars and their imported antique furniture just to satisfy the immediate crushing tax liens. They currently resided in a highly modest, remarkably cramped two-bedroom condo on the far outskirts of the city. Their absolute worst nightmare had finally materialized into a harsh, waking reality. They were officially poor, and they were entirely exiled from the elite circles they had spent their entire lives desperately clawing to reach. The country club formally revoked their membership, citing the morality clause in their bylaws. Their wealthy friends simply stopped answering their calls, treating the Elijah name like a highly contagious terminal illness. I spent those 3 months building an absolute fortress. My new massive corner office sat on the top floor of a gleaming glass high-rise in the exact center of the downtown financial district. The expansive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, uninterrupted panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. I had seamlessly and flawlessly integrated my rebuilt crisis PR firm with the newly cleansed logistics empire I had rightfully inherited from my grandfather. The Master Holding Corporation was now running with incredible transparent efficiency. We had ruthlessly purged the corrupt executives Connor had installed, completely restructuring the broken supply chain and securing 3 massive international shipping contracts. I sat behind a massive slab of polished black marble, reviewing the quarterly profit margins, when the heavy oak doors to my office slowly opened. Terrence stood quietly in the doorway. He looked at least 15 years older than he had on the night of the gala. His broad shoulders were severely slumped, and his posture was completely devoid of the commanding, arrogant presence he used to project so effortlessly. He was wearing an off-the-rack, poorly fitted suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He did not look like an apex predator anymore. He looked entirely defeated, completely broken by the sheer weight of his own profound failures. He hesitated at the threshold, clutching a plain manila folder in his calloused hands, silently waiting for my explicit permission to enter the room. "Come in," I instructed, my voice projecting a cool, detached professionalism that echoed across the expansive suite. I did not stand up, and I deliberately did not offer him a comfortable seat. Terrence walked slowly across the premium carpet, stopping exactly 3 feet away from my polished marble desk. He looked around the immaculate buzzing office, his tired eyes taking in the digital command center where my crisis team was currently monitoring global logistics feeds. He swallowed hard, his gaze finally meeting mine. His dark eyes were filled with a desperate, heavy exhaustion that bordered on total despair. "Jasmine," he began, his voice completely lacking its usual thunderous, authoritative resonance. "I know you are incredibly busy managing all of this. I will not take up much of your valuable time. I am only here because your mother and I have exhausted absolutely every other available option. The mandatory legal fees for Connor's federal defense team have completely drained what little liquid cash we had left after the asset seizures. Aaliyah is facing massive civil lawsuits from her former suppliers. We are drowning." He paused, clearly waiting for me to offer a sympathetic word, a comforting gesture, or a daughterly reassurance. I offered him absolute, unyielding silence. "I am asking for your help." Terrence continued the words, visibly causing him intense physical pain as they left his throat. "We are still your family. I know we made terrible, unforgivable mistakes. I know I was completely blind to what Connor was secretly doing with the company accounts. But Aaliyah desperately needs a job. She is a hard worker when she applies herself. She could easily manage the social media division for your PR firm. And your mother and I just need a small temporary financial loan. Just enough working capital to cover our basic living expenses until the federal trial is completely over and the dust finally settles. You are running a massive, highly profitable, clean logistics empire now. A small financial gesture would mean absolutely nothing to your bottom line, but it would save us from total absolute ruin. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, slowly clasping my hands together and resting them comfortably on my lap. I looked closely at the man who had spent my entire childhood firmly telling me I was a relentless disappointment. I looked at the man who had actively cheered and applauded while my brother systematically tried to destroy my professional reputation. He was standing in my magnificent office begging me to finance his daily comfort, using the very empire he had explicitly told me I was entirely unfit to run. No, I stated. The single word was calm, crisp, and completely unyielding. Terrence flinched as if I had struck him. Jasmine, please, be reasonable. You have more money and corporate power than you could ever possibly spend in a lifetime. You cannot just leave your own sister out on the street. You cannot just abandon your parents when they are begging for mercy. I am not abandoning anyone. I corrected him, my tone sharpening into a lethal, precise edge. I am simply refusing to finance your consequences. Aaliyah ran a fraudulent company using stolen money. If she requires employment, she can submit her resume through the standard human resources portal on our corporate website, where her application will be evaluated purely on her professional merits. Given her heavily documented history of gross financial mismanagement and brand failure, I highly doubt she will pass the initial background screening. As for your temporary loan, I am not a charity bank, Terrence. I do not issue unsecured capital to individuals with a proven public track record of catastrophic financial negligence. His face flushed a dull, angry red, a brief, pathetic flash of his old, volatile temper rising to the surface. You are punishing us out of pure, unadulterated spite, he accused, his voice rising in volume. You are sitting up here in your massive ivory tower, enjoying your absolute power, rubbing our faces in our misfortune, just because you finally hold all the cards. I shook my head slowly, maintaining my absolute composure. I am not punishing you at all. I am establishing an absolute, uncompromising boundary. For 35 years, you evaluated my worth entirely based on what I could do to elevate your fragile social status. When I failed to conform to your superficial, pristine expectations, you ruthlessly discarded me. When I built my own independent firm, you actively tried to burn it to the ground to force my submission. I stood up, placing my hands flat against the cool surface of the black marble desk, leaning forward to ensure he absorbed every single syllable. You made it abundantly clear exactly how you operate. So I am simply applying your own ruthless corporate philosophy. I maintained a steady, unwavering gaze, delivering the final, absolute verdict using the exact phrasing he had weaponized against me for decades. I am just protecting the legacy from those who do not measure up. Terrence opened his mouth to argue, but there was absolutely nothing left to say. His own words had been perfectly turned into the heavy iron lock on his permanent cage. The fight completely drained out of his body. He looked down at the floor, nodding slowly, recognizing that he was completely defeated. He turned around and walked out of my office, the heavy oak doors closing softly behind him, permanently severing the final toxic tie to my past. I sat back down in my chair, turning my attention to the massive windows overlooking the sprawling, sunlit city. The resolution was clean, absolute, and undeniably sweet. The family that had carelessly thrown me away had lost absolutely everything trying to systematically destroy me. They had blindly traded their integrity for the hollow illusion of power, and they had been left with nothing but useless ashes. I gently opened the top drawer of my desk. Sitting perfectly framed inside a small custom acrylic display case were the two crisp $1 bills my mother had shoved into my hand on the night of the gala. They were no longer an insult. They were a magnificent trophy. They represented the exact price of admission to my absolute, undeniable independence. My secure phone buzzed on the desk, lighting up with an encrypted message from Silas. The offshore accounts had been successfully repatriated, and the new international shipping lanes were smoothly operational. The Master Holding Corporation was thriving, completely cleansed of the deep corruption that had plagued it for years. I was no longer the discarded daughter, the scapegoat, or the family failure. I was the sole, undisputed architect of an unbreakable empire built solidly on the very foundation they had arrogantly overlooked. I smiled, opening the digital file for my next major global client, and got exactly back to work.